Well, welcome to the second episode of Culturally Appropriate for the month of February, and thank you for joining us on this incredibly dreary day. We've, as always, got a packed show for you. Our first guest is Bobby Curlee Jr., and he's going to talk to us a little bit about AI and what that means for the creative class, especially the music industry in Nashville, songwriters, and all of the other ancillary positions around that. Next, we're going to talk about the movie American Fiction, the five-time Oscar nominee that will be up for some statues here in about 3 weeks. And as always, we're going to end with our weekly film rundown. So I'd like to go ahead and welcome Bob Curlee Jr. to the show.
Hey, Jerod, how are you?
Doing great. How are you?
Doing great.
So I was fascinated. I was in, Bobby and I are doing this program with the Nashville Arts and Business Council and the Tennessee Arts Commission. And we got into a conversation about AI the other day, and I just found it incredibly fascinating. So I wanted him to come on the show. And I think you've got a podcast planned about this very issue that's going to be launching pretty soon. Is that correct?
That's correct. My hope is by end of March, we're putting all the final preparations together to specifically talk about AI and creativity for the creator economy.
Great. So tell us a little bit about your career path and how you got to be interested in this particular subject.
Sure. Well, I'll first start with I graduated from the University of Miami. This was roughly the last ice age of 1993, if I recall, with a bachelor's of music. I studied classical guitar, but my focus was really audio engineering. I was always the techie person, and I did everything I could to follow all the film students around because that was just a kind of a parallel love of what I wanted to do. I moved to Nashville. I worked in and around the studios quite a bit, some as a guitar player, mostly on the engineering side. And by virtue of trying to pick up gigs and work and just establish myself, several people approached me about, hey, can you help us get our song on the internet? And I had no idea what the internet was. This was 95. And of course it's in its infancy, but I began to edit audio, if you will, and even in some cases, even video. That was the very early days. So it was pretty brutal as far as quality and standards go. But I stuck with that and I stayed along that path and wound up just living in the IT space around media and entertainment and kind of the marketing and branding side of things, but more on the tech side. I always had this desire to get back into the music piece, which I guess about 7 years ago I did. I opened a small recording studio, really cutting demos for fellow friends, songwriters, and folks that I know, and kind of building up towards that, just kind of as a personal passion. But that's basically how I got here. The last two companies I worked for, global brands, working on the consumer side facing, so they were heavy in multimedia and video. One was in the automotive industry. The other was in cloud and cloud computing, and they provide massive amounts of storage and capacity for companies like Netflix and iTunes, and of course other video and audio platforms. So I really got to learn that side of it in a real deep way, which brought me to how workloads and all this intellectual property was working. And the conversation of AI hit really about 3-4 years ago when ChatGPT was really kind of first introduced to the market. That really was the game changer for me. Was, wow, I want to know more about this in particular and get into what is AI today versus what I've known it as in the past.
Yeah. So there's been this sort of line that AI is a neutral technology and it's only what humans do with it that causes the problem. I don't know that I buy that. I've noticed my students' papers lately are getting a lot more sophisticated, but are also saying less than they ever have. Lots of facts. It's almost like watching a Jeopardy episode. So do you believe that AI is a neutral technology? And if you don't, what do you think the benefits of it and the pitfalls of it are?
Neutral technology. I see AI as a force multiplier for people. I see it as an opportunity for us to use it in research to help us kind of organize our thoughts, to try to build things. As far as neutral or neutrality goes, wow, that is a huge question. And it gets into democratized access. It gets into the ethics and use of, it gets into intellectual property. At this point, can't say that I see it as being a neutral technology, only because some of the way in which it behaves and some of the outcomes that you get from it as a product, it is still very much in its infancy, but it's very interesting to see kind of where it's going. As far as benefits, it like I say, it's a force multiplier. It gives us a chance to do research and things in a way we've never been able to do before. Some of the pitfalls are kind of what we talked about on the outputs. You'll hear the term hallucinations with generative AI tools like ChatGPT and Claude 2 and a few others, where you'll give it a prompt to say, for instance, as a publicist, write me a 2-paragraph speech on a product that I'm putting out today. And it will start fine. It seems to go well, but then as you get through the end of those 2 paragraphs, it's almost it's just over elaborating. It's putting too many words. In some cases, it just kind of goes off into the ether. You're not even sure what the topic is anymore. The longer you let it run, you have to put constraints on it. If you don't put constraints on it, what you get at the final stage can be very interesting, to say the least, which could lead to some of your rambling papers that you're seeing coming in from people.
Yeah, and I think the fact that you just said the way it behaves was kind of chilling to me. I'm getting some like Terminator 2001 vibes going on here, which I know is a cliche, but that's something that we've really been sort of figuring out how to integrate this at a college level, because is it technically plagiarism or is it not? I mean, is it more akin to like finding something on Google and copy and pasting, or is it more akin to having a paper mill write your paper for you of just these grad students? So we've been going back and forth for like a year about that at my university.
No, and those are debates that you're seeing in corporate America. You're seeing it in many, many places. One of the things, kind of one of the pitfalls and things to AI, as I mentioned, kind of the hallucinations, as it's called, is it's a black box. You can find all the research papers you want from any number of bodies. Some even refer to it as the alchemy of today. We aren't exactly sure at times how it comes up to some of the conclusions. Where did it determine this? How did it come to that? So it is interesting. But to your point, is it plagiarization? It depends on the tool and how it's used. You can provide very simple information to it, simple questions, and ask it to elaborate and give you a thesis, if you will. You can just the opposite, provide a lot of input and additional training data, as they refer to it, and ask it to summarize it for you. It can give you a nice summary of those. Those are very interesting. I find that very helpful. It's a lot of what I'll do it from time to time. And you'll see that in many business applications. But I think the difference, to your point of, is it like a search versus something else? At its core, and if you don't mind, I'll kind of go quickly into some of the technical aspects of really what it is. They're called foundation models. A foundation model is just a body of text, a corpus, and it's unlabeled. And it's just, you put together a LLM, as it's called, a large language model, such as ChatGPT is merely an instance of that. And these are all just algorithms. This algorithm will run against that body, and based upon, its science that's there, will derive certain outputs that it tries to generate. You can then train those additionally by adding additional inputs to kind of shape the language and things that you would like to see or hear, if you will. And ultimately, you get a human-like text or text-like output from it. But it isn't directly giving you what went in. There's a lawsuit actually right now from the New York Times suing OpenAI, the founders and owners of ChatGPT, and it's related to this, that their information is being used in a different context than, the way Google would index your site and provide access and links back to you. It's providing a derivative work in many cases. And again, my experience, and I've been working with this now for about 3 years, I'd call it a rough starting point, but if you're running through a little writer's block or you're just needing some extra research, it's a great way to gather some things, but you definitely are going to want to go through and do your next phase, which really gets into the basis of some of these lawsuits that are coming out for it. Is it plagiarization? Is it a derivative work? Is it merely using it as you or I would doing a research paper? We find white papers and we find journals and scholarly articles, and we put something together and write our own take of a document. But there's a lot that goes into that. It's taking some of the legwork out. A lot of that's to be determined. These lawsuits are going to be very interesting to watch. especially as it relates to the arts, because in some of the cases for visual art, the courts have stood in favor of the generative AI tools in companies and people who are using these tools versus the artist, mainly because they could not determine copyright or ownership or when the work was actually created. So that creates a very interesting scenario for creators, both written music and even in the visual space, for these tools as we go forward.
And I'm thinking about in the early days of Google, whenever they had the plan to basically photocopy or crawl every single book ever written, and the
Yep.
publishing companies pushed back and they weren't allowed to do that.
Yep.
How is that case different in terms of copyright than some of these cases we're seeing, like the New York Times when they came out over the summer?
Of my understanding of the New York Times case that's come out, it's really more how the information is being used to create a derivative work, or used in the money making side of the generative AI and the LLMs. Whereas in the past, Google, with their Google Books and how they wanted to have everything available in their library, and again with search, companies paid for AdWords and paid for search and paid for sponsor, but all those would derive as a hyperlink back to you, where you got to provide your view, your take, your words, your intellectual property. This is different in the sense that it is creating what would be possibly a different intellectual property. And then maybe it differs in opinion based upon what was all used and how the prompt and the information that came back would be. It may differ greatly. Even you may find yourself standing in contrast to your own words. It's always a possibility. So to me, it's really, what is the outcome? The primary outcome is I'm sending someone to you as a search engine, whereas an LLM or a GPT, as they refer to them, is creating something as a derivative from that.
So my understanding of the New York Times case too is that, and you mentioned this a little bit, that these New York Times articles, basically what ChatGPT and a lot of these companies have done is just get a New York Times subscription, get all of the articles that gives you access to everything that paper has ever published, and then use those articles to train, like a writing teacher might use a New York Times article to train somebody. But as I understand it, the issue is that the AI remembers that stuff and then regurgitates portions of that, and that's how it sort of learns to communicate, learns to write. Is that a
It's
vast oversimplification?
No. It's actually, and in simple terms, it's exactly what's going on here. Take something like the New York Times. It's a very well established institution. The editorial is one of the highest forms of journalism that we've had. Okay, so it is trusted information, or at least there's a method they use to make sure this information is well vetted and presented to the public when it's published. Whereas the internet overall, I think it's fair to say in general, it's probably not a very trusted source when it comes to information. At least, you still can use it, you can still find it, you can still index it, but it's a very different mechanism. There's a lot that went into the New York Times piece. So for them, part of this AI mechanism, if I use it to build that foundational model, my corpus, but then I train additional to it, that's really where the sticky part comes into play. Because when you're doing what they call associations or associates, this is a much smaller format. You're not using terabytes of data. It's usually, in the hundreds of thousands of records or documents, if you will, and that would be even on the large side. But you could shape that language to read more like specific to New York Times or to someone else. And that may be where a lot of their, I think, concern comes from. Also, just the fact that their intellectual property was used as a good to develop another piece without them receiving any benefit directly from, and people are deriving value from it. So we'll see where it really goes. But you're correct. It is that no one gave them permission, and there isn't really a precedent out there. In fact, I think it's probably safe to say the data scientists and engineers that were doing this training and building this foundation model saw it through the same eyes as search engine. Is we're just indexing and going to collect it, and everyone's going to be okay about it. But clearly not the case in that with the New York Times.
So we've talked a little bit here about work that's already been created. And one of the major touchstones of AI and the controversy was the Screen Actors Guild and the Writers Guild strike that happened last summer that I wrote a couple of articles about for the Pamphleteer, and the idea that AI would replace writers, or AI would
Mm.
force actors to scan their full bodies like they were going through the TSA or something like that, and use them indeterminately as extras or forever after they die. So what, in terms of the law, protects both of these? Because I know during the WGA strike, a court ruled that AI is not copyrightable. So if you have an AI program, write a book, write a screenplay, the studio can't own it according to American law now. I
Sure.
know the other issue just kind of got pushed under the rug, and I really don't know why, in terms of the full body scanning and the consent to do that. But what are your thoughts about that other flip side? Not the copyright infringement stuff, but the
Sure,
replacement.
sure. Well, that's the big piece when it comes to call it the songwriters and musicians side of things that you see in Nashville, and more importantly, so even in film, because um, the tools. If you look at what's available today through Google, their Dolly, their new platform, and Bart's about to go away. They're able to render entire video scenes that are so realistic. It is kind of frightening. And we've kind of had part of that happening, for some time now. We were talking earlier before we began recording the episode, how the Marvel series of movies, they're using a certain engine to render all the objects and things. You change some colors, change the actor, change some of the background, bam, you got another movie in the series. Doesn't really help because people kind of get tired of it. There's nothing really new. It's not refreshing. It's just more the same graphics, or you're pushing it. But without question, I think it was Tom Sizemore. He's been a character actor for many, many years in Hollywood. You hardly hear about him anymore. I think he's pretty much given up on Hollywood. His comments were, to be in Hollywood today, you just need to be able to stand in front of a green screen and look good. And so it's been there. It's been happening. There is legislation that's being introduced, at least being discussed, on the ability to not be able to reproduce, say, a singer's voice, a person's image, because you do see that. You see all the time people will take an image of, say, George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, some historic figure, and they'll animate it as if it's speaking. It's getting there. It's getting close, but it's one of those that your likeness is now something that is being looked at as a possible of copyright and not being infringed upon. And it needs to be there. I mean, in my opinion, there's no question, unless you sign up for it as a paid person, that you're going to be a body double or some type of model used in these types of films, and they're just building an asset that can be added on and done. That's one thing. But if you're a named person, you certainly don't want your likeness to be used over and over and over without your permission, without some form of compensation, at least from the Hollywood film perspective, I would think.
So when you're talking about this, and I mean, I know that a couple of weeks ago we had this issue with Taylor Swift where
Yeah.
AI, her image was put on a nude body, and it was like pornographic material that was circulating, and she's suing. So is she going to save us from this, you think? Or is that something that's even outside the reach of Taylor Swift?
Well, I mean, I hope she does well in being able to stop what's happening to her. But here's the thing, being able to do what was done can be done off a smartphone or a tablet. It does not require a lot these days to do this. And there are always going to be a side of society and people, that percentile, small percentile that will ruin it for all of us. So those things will always kind of happen. But I do hope that, at least in this case and some of the others we've seen in recent months, that it does give protection to people's persona when it comes to social media in particular, because it is so easy to fake some of these things. And we've seen in the political space and the eco space of social media over the past 4 or 5 years, it's just become almost impossible to have a dialogue that's meaningful. And it's so easy to put someone in a situation where they're now defending themselves both from potential litigation and just public scorn over something that's completely fake. So there needs to be some protection there. There's got to be a way for these tools, when it's presented, that there's some recognition mechanism that can say, hey, that is Taylor Swift's face. This is clearly not content she would do. And we have been able to kind of block those kinds of things. But that's got to be available for everyone, you and I as well. We should be afforded the same, not just because she's a mega ultra star. Every person, every individual needs the same protections, regardless of who you are, to protect us from those kinds of situations.
And it sounds like, I mean, what we hear a lot about is copyright, but
Yeah.
it seems like there's a lot of other laws at play here that might not necessarily be working the way that they should be. So, defamation law, where it's not
Yes.
something, if it looks that realistic, could come into play. But also the role of social media companies, which are also investing in this AI
Oh,
technology, as far as I understand, and
huge.
whether or not we need to regulate them as a utility, or whether or not that, they're considered a publisher. All of these debates that have been happening sort of in the wake of 2020. Um, do you think that AI is going to reignite some of those debates, and maybe end up changing the way that we look at some of these social media companies?
It's been happening. It is elevating every single day. There was recently a news article I saw where hearings on social media have kicked back off again in Washington, and Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, a Republican, made the statement that social media is destructive to democracy, and that's one of those face to the head kind of moments, and it's like, and coming from the source where we see so many problems in social media that are political in nature. I know it's going to happen. It's already there. There's a lot of conversations about this, and there's just not a lot of law. Sadly, where you do see a legal precedent coming into play, and they're trying to apply laws to this. Again, what I have found in my research is most of it seems to be still leaning towards the AI mechanisms where one must show proof. Now, in defamation, we've seen these situations in the past where people have superimposed photos and done these kinds of things. There's always an opportunity for that. Some of that just needs to come forward into digital media, but sadly, it seems like the law in the United States towards copyright, intellectual property, and these types of social economic situations and cultural situations, we seem to be behind, and yet we're supposed to be the leader pushing some of this. So it is disappointing, but it is something that we're going to have to get in front of. But that's one of the reasons I'm trying to be an advocate for this, is it's all our responsibilities. We cannot just wait for big tech or some corporate entity or a government institution to do this. We all need to be aware of what's happening, and we need to be speaking up about this and just keeping it front brain, being aware of what's actually going on around us.
Yeah, I mean, we sort of see this kind of broken political system as well, where each individual state is trying to pass the same set of laws depending on which party is in control. And as we all know, a lot of these AI companies have very deep pockets and can afford
Yep.
very good lobbyists. So, how is this not going to be a David and Goliath situation for this grassroots effort? Because whenever we talk about grassroots combating AI just sort of seems like throwing rocks at an Iron Man suit or something like that.
It is. And that's really where I tell people, at least from, you look at it in the music side, bringing it back kind of to the Nashville creative side, and that conversation. Think of it as a force multiplier. You need graphics, you need an icon, and it's been around for more than a decade in the music space, where I record a song at home, I get a kind of a mix that I like, but I can upload it to any number of websites or download. I can have tools on my desktop that, based upon learning it's done at a genre, I can say, mix my song like rap, or mix my song like country, or mix my song like this, and then do the mastering. Those have already been in place, and they're based on patterns and vectors, and that exists now. So it's one of those, people are using it, have been using it. They just need to understand that's what they're using. In the writing space, Grammarly, I love Grammarly. I use Grammarly all the time. It's like on every device I have. And they have really advanced their place in AI. And many people do not realize it is AI behind the scenes. And there's a lot that's happening there. So you need to be aware of what's going on. But it's definitely a scenario where if you don't embrace it as a small person, with things like kind of tying it back, say, to that New York Times lawsuit. Say the New York Times wins and there's an injunction, and out of that, there is some form of legislation that comes into play that says large language models and AI models in general have to institute certain forms of transparency and maybe an opt-in, opt-out mechanism. We saw that in the early internet with email opt-in, opt-out, and SMS text messages opt-in and opt-out. It took a decade for those things to go in place, and they're far from perfect, but they're costing hundreds of millions of dollars every year, both to businesses and to taxpayers, for these things to be there. If we add that additional cost and burden on top of businesses, depending on how we do it, what you're going to see is, like today, ChatGPT, you can get a monthly subscription for like $20. And for most users, you'll never spend more than that. If you go over a certain number of words, or tokens, as they call them, yeah, you can spend some extra money, but you would have to do extensive amount of work to break that $20 barrier. But if all this has to go into it, now all of a sudden the concept of democratized access to this technology goes out the door. It becomes financially impossible for the small person to even have access to it. To me, it's incredibly detrimental to any number of groups. Think of minority groups. Just think of where I live. I live in a very rural area. It's a more agricultural environment than it is, big city, and big industry. Now all of a sudden you're going to see a displacement of people who will have access to these capabilities. And that is a big concern. That's something that a lot of people that own the AI or have investment in, Elon Musk being one, whether people agree with his political positions or not, he is a very strong advocate for understanding transparency and making sure that these tools are in the wrong hands, and that how these tools are managed, we need to be very cautious about it. He's even warned that they're not ready. We should not be using them in the way we are using them today in many cases. So it's definitely something that the small person, we have to be aware of for certain communities and people, that they could be left out. And this type of power concentrated, depending on which full hat you wear, it doesn't look good. It doesn't look good at all. So we definitely need oversight. We need transparency, especially as we start looking towards the humane side of it, because the biggest disruption of all of this is going to be people losing jobs. So what do we do with people? How do we, again, creative folks, I can feed a prompt to one of the ChatGPT models and tell it to create, a MIDI file, which would represent drums and a bass and a keyboard progression. I can do that right now. It takes just several minutes, and I've got basically a simple track that I could use to build a song from. There's, a lot to be said, how that would be used, when that would be used, and ultimately the quality. I think in the end, though, the human experience is a part that's going to save us. And if we can come together, setting aside biases and opinions, and keeping that humane side as an important aspect to this, we want real things. We want real contact. We are social creatures. And I think if we respect each other in that regard, we'll find a way to make these tools work for us. But it's something that's going to take a long time, and it's going to take a level of transparency I don't think we've really ever had before when it comes to technology and in government, and just the overall access to the population to be able to use them.
And so we've talked a little bit about how we have displaced workers. We've talked a little bit about the copyright side as well. Something else that concerns me that I don't think people are paying a lot of attention of, and you really hit on it when you were talking about Grammarly, is how AI might change the way that people create.
Yep.
I love Grammarly. I use it every day as well. But a lot of times it not only tells me what I should be saying, but it grades me based on what I'm saying. Whenever I know I don't want to say this. And we've sort of been leaning toward this for years. I mean, in the film industry, where we've been getting to the lowest common denominator, where, does a movie even exist anymore? Can we call The Lion King a live action film? If it's completely CGI generated and the CGI is just thrown in, or something like the last Ant-Man movie, where the CGI was just kind of like not even finished when it came out, and they just kind of changed the aspect ratio on certain scenes to make it look done. I'm also thinking about Nicholas Carr's article from about 15 years ago, was Google making us stupid, and how he talks about in that Nietzsche's typewriter made him a more forceful writer. We're not thinking in the same way because of Google already. So where do you see that in terms of the danger scale, the way that creatives themselves might not be as ambitious anymore, might not really have the capabilities anymore in a couple of generations? I mean, is this a problem that's one of the bigger ones we should be looking at, or is this just more of a side effect?
I think a lot of that goes back into the responsible use of you as an individual, and I think, we are, as creatures, that's going to vary. We are going to have variety throughout our lives. Something I was going to mention earlier about how I even got into AI goes back to the early days for me in working in the music business and more around kind of the business environment. I always struggled with writing in particular, and had to find a way to work around it, to find out I actually had a disorder for writing, where think of it as almost like a permanent writer's block. And I had to find ways to help me get past that. I've used tools like speech to text for decades. It's been a huge help for me. It's something that I really needed, and it's made a huge benefit in every aspect of my life. But I definitely wouldn't use the text that it gave me raw. Some of that stuff, even in today's terms and capabilities we have, is just all over the place. I go back to force multiplier. I think we can find a way to build it into our workflows, but there's a responsibility side of it. And we need to be aware of where it's going. Ultimately, it kind of eye on the prize. What is the intent? What is the end state? What are you trying to create? My challenge to any creative out there is do not let the tool compromise your vision. Just like you mentioned about Ant-Man and some of the stuff, they just put it together and dumped it out there, rendered it, and we're gone. Do not let the tool be the deciding factor. It's a tool for a purpose, right? It serves a purpose. It has something. But when you take away that vision of where you want it to be and offset it because of some mechanism you've got, to me, you see those stand out. I look at, in fact, I just canceled my Amazon Kindle Unlimited subscription because so many of the books they were recommending to me, they're very small, a couple hundred pages, self-edited type books. You could tell it was written mostly by some type of GPT of some sort, and they were horrible. I'm like, this is of no value to me. Why am I going to spend $10 a month to get 15, 20, 30 recommendations for something I can easily see someone did not take the time to properly edit it and tell me the story they were trying to tell me. It's not worth my time. I don't want to do that. I think like anything, Malcolm Gladwell talks about the tipping point. We're going to see it kind of come up to a point, but ultimately we're all going to have that realization, just like the DC Marvel movies themselves. We're just tired of it. You're going to have to do something different. We're missing the storytelling side when we need to get back to that. And that is the human experience in of itself. And when you look at the failures and the pitfalls of some of these large language models and the deep learning algorithms and things, you quickly see the weakness in what we have in this computing capability, how we know so little of the human brain, and that's reflected in some of these hallucinations and some of the way in which outputs are done. So that's where I think we have to be careful who is in control, and those who are using it. There has to be a level of responsibility in its use, and it's all about transparency. We need to be completely transparent in what is happening with these, especially right now, to make sure we really understand it.
So how is AI affecting your particular creative practice? I know you're sort of getting ready to start some new creative endeavors, including the podcast. So, how is that relating to what it is that you're doing now and what you're about to do?
Sure. Well, I definitely am a user of AI, especially on the side of research. There's a couple of tools I've found in particular that I like because not only do they help take information that I put in as inputs, they also will go find and recite information from various sources. And it gives me an opportunity to go read that source to see if that's something that I want to use, not want to use, and kind of give me a summarization of some of the findings. I still take the time to go and read the resources and things that they provide to me to see the relevancy of it, and I edit it down. I find it like anything else. It's kind of like a form of free writing. I sit down, instead of using pen and paper and writing 3 or 4 pages or something for, say, 20 minutes at a time about a topic, it can do that for me in just a few minutes. I still have to spend that time, the same time I would in cleaning up that free writing session I did over those 3 pages to kind of distill it down to what I want. But it does help me immensely in getting to that point, what I'm looking for. The other side is some of the basic creation and tools. I use it in, like right now, in music production, things I'm doing for sync libraries. I have a couple of plugins from the software that I use that help me master my music just, in a little more automated way. It's not perfect. I say it gets me about 80% there, but it would save me 30 minutes to an hour to get to that 80%. And then I can come back and put the final touch that I want to paint the picture that I'm looking for. So I'm definitely using it as a research piece and as an assistant. And again, it's been a big part of it for quite some time. In video, you're seeing a lot of it in video too. And some of the newer tools that are coming out, providing rendered images and objects, backgrounds where you can overlay a person into a scene, and it literally looks like they are there when they're standing in front of a green screen. I've not really used much of that yet. I can see the application of that, If you're trying to tell various stories from maybe a film or a documentary, or even just from a social media perspective. But they will be there. There's parts of that I don't see that being something I would use in my tooling, but for an independent musician, where you can buy stock footage, or you can get stock footage, hire people to generate that for you, and then render various objects and make derivative elements of it. Making a music video for an independent musician is something you could probably do for a few $100s with any of these tools, versus having to hire a crew and get a permit to film a Nashville street. I mean, how many photos do we have of the Nashville skyline? How many videos are available that have been made available of fly-throughs of downtown Nashville? As long as you can use that in a proper way where you can license it, and companies like Canva and many others have entire libraries of this type of stock footage. Those would be a big benefit to the independent musician trying to have a visual presence in social media for what their art is.
And it seems to me like, as much as the public is sort of having this conversation, I don't always know that outside of their personal work, they're always happy with it. I mean, I hear this all the time, that when you see a music video and it looks just like a cookie cutter music video that somebody did this to, it's obvious, as opposed to somebody who goes in with the camera and has this unique perspective of the Nashville skyline, or is, making some sort of artistic comment with it.
That's right.
So I'm hoping at this point that, the audience is sort of going to create the demand for this kind of return to not just more original content, but the practicalities of things like production design or audio engineering.
Yeah, you're hitting on a heartstring for me. It's really kind of at the core of why I want to put my neck out there and bring kind of my background as a musician and what I'm doing in music, but also with kind of the technical space. Is you've seen this progression happen already in the music industry, specifically in music production. There was recently announced, I believe it was Warner, it could have been Universal. I apologize, I should have looked it up. But they're just laying off the entire record side, or the production side of their operations. And their reasoning was that they feel that the individual artists want more control to make their own records and have the capability to do it on their own, which I think is great. That gives them that capability. But for a very, very long time, that was totally controlled. The way songs are written, even to this day, they shove people in a room. You got 2 hours, you're going to come out with something. To me, with what I hear in the music business coming out of Nashville, there's so many people that complain about the music that's there. And if you look at the indie artist landscape, that's the fastest growing segment in the music business, is the independent artist. And terms like gothic country, I never thought I would heard that, are terms that are there, and you're finding amazing music and real art. And people are learning to use their iPhone cameras and buy a small Sony EV10 and go out and shoot footage and do some editing with it. I have no problem using certain tools to help you augment that, and add-ons and things for Premiere or DaVinci, whatever you're using. But the key is, what is it that you want to say? Tell a story, and they're tools. Use those tools. The moment you try to get economies of scale out of it and rubber stamp it, that's what you're seeing. That's why so many people, I think, have turned away from Hollywood. In fact, my family, even though we live in a very rural area, we have Starlink for our primary internet, and we have no television, no satellite. It's only streaming. And we've been that way for several years now. And we love the small screen. I love the documentaries. I love the series. Give me a 7-episode series, murder mystery or something of that nature, versus a full featured film with all this explosions and pyrotechnics. Something that's shot in the perspective of people. I feel like I'm in the room with the actor. I feel like I'm a part of the conversation. That's what's missing in a lot of music today. And it's become so plastic. And that's what I think has ultimately hurt Hollywood. So I'm encouraged that the tools are available and people can create film. I mean, really, really great film, great documentary, great music. And that there are tools available to help us, polish it, make it seem a little more professional. I would just caution on the side of, again, don't let the tool be the deciding factor. Do not lose the aspect of story and of the human experience. That's got to be the key part of anything that's creative. That is what keeps us alive. Let's do our best to uphold our humanity for ourselves and for everyone else as we look at these tools and use them responsibly.
So when your podcast debuts later this spring, what do you want audiences to take away, and what kind of audiences are you hoping to draw to this show?
That's a good question. The takeaway would be that these tools are there. They're not going away. I would want to be able to help people understand that they need to use these tools in a responsible way and understand their responsibility with it. It's really no different than a driver's license. You have a car, you're going to operate that vehicle. You need to understand and be respectful to you, but also the other people on the road. We're all trying to get somewhere, right, in life, and we, in many cases, don't even know where we're going 100%.
I think we may have lost Bobby. Hopefully not. Might just be a little freeze
Yes.
here.
Did I lose you?
Yeah, you lost me for just a second. So
I pick back up.
yes.
The takeaway from the podcast would be that people understand their personal responsibility in using these tools, and that it's not just themselves, but it's also in the interest of others. As I said, it's like a driver's license. You're driving a car. You have to be responsible for you, but you also have to be responsible for those on the road, because we're all trying to get somewhere. The key thing, though, is that they're available. You can use them. It's just making sure that you're aware of the impact and the consequences. The biggest are the consequences. That's one of the things that the social media has hopefully taught many people. If you can't hide behind a screen and what you type in all cases, and we need to understand these things live and can live beyond us. So you use discretion. You use your mind. Have a purpose. Have an understanding, but use those tools. That would be the takeaway. The audience would be definitely the creative audience, and those specifically who are more the independent person, those who are trying to find a way to augment what they're doing. We think of it. We buy templates all the time. I have a ton of them for music work around sync licensing and songwriter split sheets that say we own certain percent of the song, where there's other tools and things that are in our day-to-day lives we need to help us do our work. And if we find the tools that can help us get us there, like a Grammarly to help us kind of make sure we're not spelling things and having homonym nightmares appear in our middle of our documents, leverage it to be that force multiplier. But it's definitely more that independent person to help them, and those who are going to be honestly the greatest at risk of losing access to these tools, or not having an opportunity to really advance where they want to be in life because of lack of understanding. It's really all about education and trying to bridge that gap. Yes, it could be destructive to you, but look at how it could help you. Yes, there's things that it's going to change the way we create, but understand at the end state, you are the creative force, not that. So that would be my hope in trying to bridge that gap, and the fusion of creativity and technology, and how we can really use those to get our voice and have an independent voice, and be able to speak openly and freely about the things that we're passionate about.
Great. Well, we will definitely be tuning in and hopefully be able to give you some promotion when you get that started. So, Bobby, thanks so much for joining us today, and you have a great weekend.
I greatly appreciate it. Thank you so much.
So what we're going to be doing at the Pamphleteer over the next couple of weeks before the Oscars is profiling and discussing the major films that have been nominated that have not already been part of the show. And today we're going to talk a little bit about Cord Jefferson's American Fiction, which is a film that got 5 Oscar nominations and is probably going to walk away with a couple of statues. So this is a movie that is about an author named Thelonious Monk Ellison. And he's a literary fiction writer, a college professor who is trying to write about the African-American experience, but doesn't really consider himself a Black author. He considers himself an author of literary fiction, and he finds himself very irritated by the way that African-Americans are presented in literature. This is based on a novel by the wonderful writer Percival Everett, 2001's Erasure, which he wrote in response to the book Push by Sapphire, which ended up becoming the movie Precious, which came out about 15 years ago. So this movie is a satire, but it also touches on a lot of the major issues that we're discussing at this particular point in terms of diversity and quotas and things that might change the entertainment industry. So what this movie made me think about was a talk that I heard from film critic Elvis Mitchell in 2015. This was right after Mad Men had finished up, and everybody in the media was talking about Mad Men, which was a show that was very popular with a rich demographic, but never had a lot of widespread appeal. It was really watched by people that made over six figures. That's one of the reasons that AMC, the channel, ended up becoming $1 billion company, was because of the fact that they were able to attract these advertisers and build their brand from Mad Men. But Mitchell wanted to talk about a show called Power, which really was never in the discourse. It was a show on Stars. The sequel versions are still on now, and this is a franchise that has really been able to keep the momentum going. It outperforms a lot of cable television shows, even though it's not something that's really talked about very much at all. In terms of, if you look at magazines like Slate or Vanity Fair, no one really talks about Power. And Mitchell had a problem with this and said that one of the pitfalls of criticism out of Hollywood is essentially the fact that we don't really take such shows seriously. We don't think about them in terms of craft. And American Fiction came out, and most recently, one of its actors, Issa Rae, who created the show Insecure on HBO, had a very recent interview with Time Magazine in which she was lambasting the fact that in the wake of the writer's strike, a lot of shows by Black creators have been canceled. Issa Rae has a $10 million deal with Warner Brothers. In this interview, she said that most studio execs were stupid, which kind of makes me think, why would somebody give her $10 million be considered stupid by her? But something that really is kind of lost in the discourse is the fact that shows like Insecure, as much as everyone is talking about them in terms of legacy media and magazines and film critics and television critics, they don't draw a lot of viewers. And specifically, they don't draw a lot of viewers that are African American. So we sort of get into this catch-22 of somebody that has made their career speaking for African Americans, but it's also somebody that African Americans don't particularly want to listen to and really demonstrate no interest in. A lot of this was because Ray's most recent shows have been canceled, and she was somebody that was sort of presented as Hollywood as kind of like the next great actor. But a lot of her movies, like Little and The Photograph, which is a film that I actually liked a lot, didn't do well at the box office. So we now really see Ray on these HBO shows that not a lot of people watch, or in bigger movies like Barbie or Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. She played President Barbie in Barbie. She was Spider-Woman in Across the Spider-Verse, where people in the know can kind of nod and be like, oh, that's Issa Rae. So American Fiction takes up a lot of this. And Issa Rae in that movie plays a character, an author, who writes one of these sort of ghetto bestsellers, Weez Lives in the Ghetto. And a lot of the movie is about how white liberals lap this stuff up. But the movie also, because of the fact that it is based on a Percival Everett novel, is a little bit deeper than that. It sort of thinks about how African-American creators represent communities and what it means. I think the movie is hilarious. There's some scenes that I still think about. I will say the opening 10 minutes is the best college satire that I've ever seen in my entire life. I saw this movie 3 weeks ago and still chuckle at that scene. So it's a movie that's definitely worth seeing, but it's also a movie in some ways that falls very short. While it has these debates, while it presents these facts of an author or a creator like Issa Rae and what she's doing in Hollywood, is this ethical? Is it ethical to build a career speaking for African Americans, even though they're not interested in what you have to say? And the metrics prove that. It takes that question up, but it just kind of falls short of actually addressing it. Those characters kind of get absolved of what they're doing in this satire. And in the end, it ultimately kind of falls a little bit on scapegoating white liberals as kind of the punching bag that's responsible for all the ills of the world. So it's a movie that has a lot to say, but doesn't really reach the same conclusions as the book it's based on. So I definitely recommend watching it. I think that, both conservatives and liberals watching a movie like this are going to get a lot out of it. But more importantly, I would recommend reading Everett's book, because he really does get into some of these things. That's one of the reasons that I feel like even though he's been writing for almost 30 years, he's never been given his due as other authors have, because he doesn't really fit into that easy box. He's not going to be an Oprah or Reese Witherspoon book club pick, because he really does want to take these issues to task and think about them in very nuanced ways. So American Fiction, definitely worthy of many of its Oscar nominations, especially Jeffrey Wright and Sterling K. Brown's performances. Just the best these actors have ever been. The script is witty. It's available on premium video on demand for like $20 if you want to rent it, but it also is still playing in many theaters. And I'm sure the week before the Oscars, whenever there's the Best Picture Film Festival, they'll be added some screenings to that as well. So check it out. I think it's definitely worth your time and definitely worth the conversation. And that brings us to the other films that are opening this week in the weekly film rundown. I noticed this morning as I was preparing for the show that Hollywood is happy because Dune is expected to gross $65 million on its opening weekend and may get as high as $80. $80 million. So we're kind of in a lull right now. February is always a lull for the box office, but even so, it's more of a lull for the box office at this moment. So we've not really had a lot of major releases. That may change next week with the Bob Marley biopic and Madam Web, the latest movie in the Spider-Verse, but neither of those are really projected to do Dune numbers. So we've got a weekend where there's a lot of gems coming out, but maybe not a lot of stuff that's been heavily promoted. So the movie that I want to talk about, and one that I would kind of consider my pick of the week, is called The Promised Land. And it's a Danish movie starring Mads Mikkelsen, who you might recognize as the villain in every major Hollywood franchise. He was Hannibal Lecter on the TV show Hannibal. He was the villain in the last Harry Potter when Johnny Depp got fired. He was the villain in Doctor Strange. He was the villain in the new Indiana Jones movie. But here, he plays a real-life figure who goes to the Danish government in the 18th century, and in order to get the title of noble after working his way up to captain as a peasant in 25 years, he says that he can do the unthinkable, which is plant potatoes in an area that the king has considered is completely not fit for agriculture. And that puts him in the crosshairs of some petty local aristocracy. So there's a lot of class warfare here. This movie, you wouldn't think about a Western as a Danish movie, but it definitely is. And this movie has a lot to say about political compromise. It has a lot to say about individualism and ideals. I don't know why this movie hasn't gotten a more major recognition over the last year. I feel like it was one of the best movies that I saw. I don't know why it didn't get the Oscar push, but that one definitely is a must see. I don't know how long it will be at the Belcourt, but if you have a chance this weekend, please go see it. Beautifully crafted, wonderfully written, hilarious and shocking at the same time. I can't rave about this movie enough. Another movie that I'm really looking forward to seeing this weekend is Lisa Frankenstein, and it's the directorial debut of Zelda Williams, the daughter of Robin Williams, and written by Diablo Cody, who won an Oscar for Juno and wrote movies like Jennifer's Body and Young Adult. One of the things about Diablo Cody's career after Juno is that a lot of her movies were kind of before their time. So if you think about a movie like Jennifer's Body, when it came out, it received horrible reviews. People hated it. They dismissed it as not being a very substantial film at all. And over the past 15 years, that's a movie that's really become a cult classic, and so many people have reevaluated it. I wrote about it in the wake of the Covenant shootings for the Pamphleteer and the way that it deals with trauma and grief. So Lisa Frankenstein is a riff on Frankenstein set in the 80s. So, all of my 80s peers here, Lisa Frank, the famous stationery designer with all of the bright, flashy colors, and Frankenstein. So it stars Catherine Newton, who is kind of like a punk goth new wave teen, and she ends up creating the perfect boyfriend, Riverdale's Cole Sprouse, also one of the twins from The Sweet Life and Zach and Cody, if that was more of your generation. So the movie's supposed to be really funny, but it also has gotten very polarizing reviews. I'm going to side with Diablo Cody on this one and say that it's definitely going to be worth your time as well. We also have some other films opening up at the Belcourt. We have a movie called The Teacher's Lounge, which is Germany's nomination for Best International Film. This is one of the 5 films nominated for the Best World Film of the Year at the Oscars, and it's kind of a small-scale drama about a teacher. One of the bigger events that's happening at the Belcourt this weekend is the movie starring Daisy Ridley called Sometimes I Think About Dying, and tonight, the director of this film is going to be actually at the Belcourt, giving a talk, as well as the editor of this particular film. So this was a movie that came out at Sundance last year. We see Rey from Star Wars in more of a dramatic role. Reviews have been pretty solid, but if you're interested in meeting a filmmaker and hearing that filmmaker talk about her work, that is definitely coming up tonight. I also don't want to underestimate how important the Belcourt's work has been in terms of programming and screening series. They've got a great series now that we talked a little bit about last week called Swoon, which are romantic movies. And what we're seeing happening this weekend is a restored print of Charlie Chaplin's classic City Lights, the first film Charlie Chaplin made after sound came in, and he was defiantly silent and even made fun of the fact that sound was coming into the movies. That'll be playing this weekend. And then on Wednesday, for Valentine's Day, Casablanca will be screening, considered by some the greatest Hollywood product of all time, a movie that's the perfect film. I don't know that's necessarily the happiest movie to watch on Valentine's Day, but as we all know, a lot of these classics that are the most romantic don't always end up the way that we might want them to. So regardless, we have a wealth of options this weekend at the Multiplex and at the Belcourt and other indie theaters. So considering it's so dreary and kind of cold, might be a great time to go out and see a movie. And that concludes our weekly film rundown and the show. So whatever you get up to this weekend, whether it's a festival, whether it's a movie, just give it some thought. Have a good one.